You might have heard me go on about multi-agency meetings in the homelessness sector, and you might also be wondering why Mike has such a bee under his bonnet about multi-agency meetings. And there's various reasons which I'm going to talk quite a lot about in the coming months, because I've just been involved in a very interesting case indeed, which I can't yet talk about, but I will be able to soon. And it involves multi-agency meetings, and I guess I've said bits of this elsewhere on the channel, but I just thought I'd kind of talk about it again just to make it a single point really. When I used to work in the voluntary sector back in, like, you know, kind of the noughties or whatever, I hate calling it that, the 2000s or whatever, and into the 2010s, so I don't know why I just didn't say up till 2013 there. Basically, I was under this illusion in the homelessness sector that if you have someone, an individual, and they have lots of different needs, you kind of check them off on the list, you know, substance misuse, criminal offending, mental health issues, whatever. And in my head, I thought that if someone has lots of boxes ticked on these kind of assessment forms, what they need is someone from each of those relevant sectors to be involved in their support. So if they've got mental health issues, if they've got substance misuse issues, you need to bring all of those professionals into one room and basically decide what that person needs. And when I remember, there's one example of a case, again, I don't think I've mentioned it yet on the channel, but when I worked at Bedford Night Shelter, and then when I moved to work at Bedford Borough Council, there was an individual who was street homeless at the time. She was absolutely lovely. She had Huntington's chorea. We didn't actually have a diagnosis of that yet. She's since passed, sadly. And she was coming to the attention of lots of services, you know, kind of for various reasons. And I think at one point she was involved in like 15 different organisations for various reasons. And I thought, okay, the answer to this is we need to get all these organisations under one roof, basically to decide what we do with her. And I wince now when I think back about that, but that was kind of the philosophy I was steeped in at the time. And I remember one particular organisation, this little social work organisation, which was awesome. Like, I learned so much from them. They don't exist anymore, sadly, but they were social workers who were helping people with substance misuse issues, basically. And I remember them saying, you know, we're going to have a multi-agency meeting. Okay, well, you know, what time can we get her there? You know, how do we get her there? And I was like, immediately, I was like, what? You can't bring her in here. She's really chaotic. She's not going to know what, you know, what's best for her. Again, I wince when I think back about this. And then yeah, they really dug their heels in and basically just called out my bullshit, really. Invited her in, and we proceeded to have incredibly productive, genuinely productive meetings with her there. And again, you might just be thinking, how on earth can a professional think like that? And I don't know fully, but I did. And that kind of set me on this path of understanding the importance of individuals being part of their kind of solutions. It's nuts to think about it like that. And at the same time, I was chairing the multi-agency, the panel in Bedford. And again, at one point we had like 30 different organisations meeting up every 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever. And we'd discuss a list of people's names who were at risk of rough sleeping or who were rough sleeping. And again, I just thought, you know, the philosophy was the more support needs they have, the more support organisations you need to have involved. And again, what I found was they were completely ineffective. And I remember after one particular meeting, the homelessness nurse pulled me aside and said, look, Mike, this is really dodgy, like data protection wise, you know, you can't do this. Basically, I can't, you know, she was saying I can't share details about my patients here because no one else in this room pretty much needs to know that information. And that's kind of one of the key ideas here, is that you don't share information unless there's actually a need to know. And that kind of set me off on this really kind of like long kind of tangent where I kind of stopped what I was doing, went and checked out what the law was. The ICO's website was a really good resource, you know, kind of googled some cases and stuff like that. There's a really interesting case called Clift v Slough, where she got like 12 grand compensation or something for essentially just kind of information being shared more than it needed to be. And so I realised it was unlawful. This was when I was working at Bedford Borough Council. I kind of tried to, you know, kind of alert other people to this. My manager was completely unresponsive to that and proceeded to kind of do it anyway. And that formed part of my whistleblowing, in the fact that, you know, we kind of had his information from the nurse that it was unlawful. It actually was unlawful, and I checked it out, and we needed to stop it straight away. And so that's kind of a little bit of backstory to understand, you know, where I'm coming from. The reason multi-agency meetings are unlawful is because by nature of what they are and the way they're operated, they share data more than they need to. And a really good example in Bedford was the fact that Bedford Prison was part of the multi-agency panel, and it's a male-only prison, and yet female individual data would be shared with them, which is completely unlawful. Bearing in mind how sensitive the data you will be sharing in these meetings is, you can kind of see how quickly you end up committing some pretty serious breaches of the Data Protection Act. But it's not just about data protection. In one sense, data protection is the vehicle which you can use to get organisations to work properly. The real reason multi-agency meetings don't work is there's this kind of bystander intervention effect going on. And again, I'll give you some examples of the subsequent multi-agency panels in Bedford, where there was one particular time when I was supporting 4 people who were being discussed in the rough sleeper multi-agency panel, and the rough sleeper multi-agency panel did not actually take any action to house any of them. The reason they got housed was because myself, I got 3 of the people housed, and in another case, a decent housing officer outside of the panel got them housed. It seemed that the actual work of the multi-agency panel was completely kind of impotent. They weren't willing to make homeless applications. They weren't willing to push back on the council when clearly there were perverse, non-priority decisions being made. And all they were really doing was just sharing these individuals' data. And the key thing here is that the individuals didn't even know these meetings were happening. If they'd been told anything at all, they were certainly not told that their data was being shared in a forum where the police were turning up to it, and kind of all sorts of enforcement agencies were turning up to it. And any sane person, I would say, would object to their mental health being discussed with the police when the police aren't involved in their situation. And even if they were involved, even if you've been arrested, why is the police been told about your mental health issues or whatever? And it's the fact that these multi-agency meetings don't in any way take into account the person's opinions, the person who's going to know what they want, more than anyone else. And what tends to happen is these professionals kind of decide, okay, well, based on this information on paper, this hostel over here is going to be the best for this person, and then we're just going to make that happen. And then the person's kind of sort of mooching around. Suddenly some professional turns up and says, right, you're going over to this hostel here now, and they're like, I don't like the hostel, why am I going there? Why have I been told to go there? Why have I not been given any control over that whatsoever? And I touched on this in the Learned Helplessness video I did recently. If you want to help people recover from homelessness, for want of a better term, giving them as much control as they possibly can have, and sometimes those options will be limited, but giving them the most control they can possibly have in itself is therapeutic. Similar to the way that actually fighting for someone through a homeless application process by itself is therapeutic. I literally mean that. It's therapeutic. It helps people increase their well-being, to use that kind of pretty sterile language. So multi-agency meetings don't work. They're often also kind of tied up with things like the verification of rough sleeper kind of processes, which are almost certainly unlawful. There's lots of other reasons why they might fall foul of the law, but crucially they don't take the person's interests or opinions into account at all, let alone prioritise them. I mean, really, when you are working with someone, their opinion about what's going to work for them should basically define what professionals are doing. And yet there's this kind of strong-arming kind of sort of coercion going on in these settings where the individual's needs are completely ignored, really. Their opinions are certainly ignored, and they kind of just get pushed into things which they don't want. And one sense, imagine kind of, being told you've got 5 options, hostel over here, homeless application, hostel over there, whatever they might be, and being told, you get to choose which one it is, and you might choose hostel A, versus being told you're going to hostel A. Now, immediately, the fact that someone's had control over those options, and they then move into hostel A, it's probably not going to be ideal, but the fact is they kind of had some kind of informed decision to make to actually move in there. That is going to be a very different situation from someone who's just literally told you're going there. That's a very different kind of dynamic, and I would say a person in that situation where they've been coerced into it is probably going to sabotage it in some way, almost just this kind of way of just kind of pushing back against this coercion they're experiencing, particularly when they've got institutional backgrounds already and they're used to that kind of stuff. They just kind of almost kind of push back on it because that's what they need to do to kind of preserve their kind of individuality. So it's not that you can't work with other agencies. That's not what I'm saying. The data protection law in no way stops you doing that. But what you want to do is, and this is the only way I can see it becomes legal and effective, is you speak to the individual and say, look, who else is supporting you? Who else do you want to support you? And they might say, well, okay, I've got a decent probation officer. I've got a decent drug and alcohol worker. You say, okay, well, are you up for a meeting? Should we arrange a meeting, maybe at drug and alcohol services venue or something like that, somewhere at a time that you're happy with, and we'll just kind of have a chat and work out how it is we can support you. That is completely legal because that person has complete control over who's there and who the data is then shared with. That's a good way to work. But you can't just have these conveyor belt meetings where you're discussing like 20 or 30 people. You know, that might seem like it's saving you money. It might be the kind of this seeming scale of economy or whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't work. So, you know, as I say, in my experience of those kind of meetings, very rarely do they result in even someone getting housed at all. And when they are housed, it's because they've been coerced into it. It's because these professionals think they have a right, as I did. And, you know, again, I was just kind of stuck in this kind of weird bubble working in the sector where I thought I was the expert. And I would, you know, and basically, who's the actual expert here in someone's options in someone's life? It's going to be the individual in it. And our job is simply to maximise the options available to them, and that's why I pushed so hard on homeless applications, because often it will be a genuine option, and also it'll probably be the option which most people would go for if they have a choice, because no matter how kind of, you know, rubbish the temporary accommodation is, at least they get some kind of privacy, they kind of get some sort of autonomy. Most supported accommodation, let's be honest, is pretty grotty, and some of it's disgusting. Where would you rather be? I've only worked with a handful of people, less, you know, I can think of 3 people who've chosen supported accommodation over their own place, but over going through the homeless application when that was, you know, when that was an option for them. So, yeah, as I say, multi-agency meetings, be very wary of them. The fact that you might have some kind of data protection like agreement or something with, you know, with other organisations does not mean in any way it's legal. That is not the same thing. You know, can't, you know, a conspiracy of burglars can't just have a bit of paper saying, yeah, this is all legal. That doesn't mean it's legal. It's, you know, if you're breaking the law, if you're breaching data rights or whatever, it's going to be illegal no matter what kind of privacy notice or, you know, kind of privacy policy you've signed. So just be very wary of them. Often councils don't even know what the law is, and in my experience, when you argue with the council, they really don't know what the law is. The kind of the legal advice they get is pretty shoddy. I've seen legal advice actually been disregarded anyway. And I don't quite know why all that is. You know, why it is organisations, particularly councils, just push for that kind of model. But for me, it's doomed from the start. And the only answer, the only way forward with multi-agency meetings is to get those small, bespoke meetings where you're putting the person in the centre of it. You're making it as kind of comfortable and as unthreatening as possible, using kind of familiar settings, familiar people. And you're just basically talking with them, you're having a conversation with them, with the other partners in the room who can all say what they can all do, and then that individual gets to make the choice.